Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the final session of the 2016 OSEP Virtual Leadership Conference. This session is Internal Controls and Risk Assessment in Uniform Guidance. I am Steve Smith with the Center for IDA Fiscal Reporting, and joining me today on the presentation are staff from Utah Part B, Jennifer Howell and Tiffany Owens, and Kansas Part B, Dean Zeich, Stacy Martin, and Vera Stroop. Also joining us on the call is Charlie Nisley from OSEP and Ellen Safranek from the U.S. Department of Education. Today we're going to hear from Utah and Kansas on how they are implementing the risk-based assessment under the uniform guidance. And at the end of the presentation, there'll be time for a Q&A. So with that, I will turn it over to Jennifer and Tiffany from Utah.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everyone. This is Jennifer Howell. Worked with the Utah State Office of Education doing, establishing the risk rubric and risk identification process that Utah has put in place over the last couple of years. So Tiffany and I would just like to share with you some of our thoughts and experiences related to that. And then we'll watch for your questions as we go. So what we're planning to address today is the process that we've used for evaluating risk in both a fiscal and programmatic perspective. So there are several reasons why we decided to get started with this. And we've been, in Utah, we started this risk evaluation process in the 13-14 school year. So we have a couple of years under our belt. One of the big reasons that we did it was for cost effectiveness. We did it so that we could improve program outcomes. We wanted to be able to more effectively share the lessons that effective LEAs were learning from their programs with other LEAs. We wanted to be able to, in that same line of thinking, share promising practices from among LEA administration. And then we have this responsibility or obligation to determine a risk of noncompliance, or how likely are they to make errors in either programming services for students with disabilities or in using funds that are designated specifically for students with disabilities. And then we also wanted to design a monitoring plan. One of the big factors, moving back up to the cost effectiveness idea, one of the big factors that impacted us was that in Utah, and as I know is true in many states as well, the addition of charter schools on an annual basis. So we would have between 5 and 10 new charter schools join as independent LEAs each year. So over time, our ability to put those into a 5-year monitoring cycle, which we had been using, became less effective, and we were unable to manage just the workload that created on a year-to-year basis. We also found that introduced brand new, inexperienced LEAs into the system on a regular basis, and that they were more vulnerable to making mistakes, both on the programmatic, on the fiscal side. So with that 5-year cycle, we weren't able to give the right amount of support for LEAs based on their need. We needed to build more capacity in our state system and among the USOE staff. So previously, our responsibilities were fairly isolated. One person, Tiffany, was responsible for program monitoring, and I was responsible for fiscal monitoring. There was a separate person responsible for assessment monitoring and for monitoring of data submissions. We wanted to integrate all of that into one single system that would be effective for LEAs and also streamline things for USOE staff. And then we received complaints from LEAs about their experiences of receiving different information from different programs over time. So sometimes they would receive one piece of feedback from the special ed department, a different conflicting feedback from the Title I department, different conflicting feedback from assessment or data and statistics. So we wanted to align all of that together. Before we started with moving from a cycle-based to a risk-based system of monitoring, we pulled together a steering committee that consisted of people from the State Department of Education in special ed, data and statistics, assessment, school finance, internal audit, and the charter schools sections. Each of those groups were involved in that process. We also started with LEA special education directors, business administrators, and our Utah Parent Training and Information Center to provide feedback and input about the process of moving to a results-based system. The first year that we attempted this, we kind of had a trial by fire. LEAs were caught off guard by the amount of risk data that we reviewed. Tiffany, if you've got a moment to put in the Ask Presenters in that chat box for the group, we have a rubric that we used that identified each LEA as being at one of 5 levels, low risk to high risk. So 1 being low risk, low intervention required, and then 5 being a high risk and high intervention and support required from USOE. So in the process of trying to identify risk, we pulled together all of the data points that are available. So as you may expect, we looked at the indicators that are associated with the SPP and APR, but we also looked at other pieces of data that came directly to USOE from LEAs. So we included things like their fiscal activities. We included their data timeliness and accuracy. We included more assessment results than are required for the SPP APR in the reporting that we provided back to LEAs. This first year, our comment was, responding to a comment from Diana Austin asking if we had a broader public audience. This first year, we had limited input from groups outside of the steering committee before we implemented things. We let everyone know what was going on, but they were really surprised by how much data we provided to them. We discovered that they did not know, many of our LEA special ed directors and business administrators didn't know how to read, analyze, interpret, and apply the data. So we provided them with this information about how, from our perspective, what level of risk they had, and from our perspective, what level of intervention was required, and it was overwhelming to them. We discovered that LEA staff in the special ed department and in the business department were not effectively communicating with each other, so we proceeded with more trainings to try and get those two groups together. And with discussing this same process with both business groups and special education groups together at the same time. We found that a process to allow LEAs to preview the data that we were planning to base our risk decisions on, and to appeal if necessary if there were data errors or misunderstanding or miscommunication on the part of the State Department of Education. So we had to put in place an appeal process. We discovered that more detailed reports were required. So the first year, we told them what the data were. We gave them percentages of proficiency or the 1 to 5 rating of what level of risk we perceived, and then asked them to, or we expected that they would then take that and go to the rubric and see what that number translated to in terms of where they were scoring or what specific areas of concern we saw. And they needed a lot more information about what the source of the data was, what timeline was, because as you know, the SPP and APR timeline is, not all the data are coming from the same year, which was confusing to our LEA staff. We decided at the end of that experience, and based on the feedback that we got from LEA participants and seeing our risk decision on results-driven accountability and the determination on the other hand, and those two pieces of information should align and should feed into each other. And so we designed, beginning this year, we'll be publishing for LEAs within the next month their one common assessment report, which will include our determination of their risk and also the determination under the SPP and APR. So we integrated those and put them together into one factor for LEAs to look at, which we're starting this year based on requests that we received from them last year. And the other thing that we learned was that the rubric we provided needed to be more detailed and data-based and factual. So we added not just that you're below the target or significantly below the target. We added actual percentage ranges to say, for example, you are between 1 and 5% below the target. You're between, you're more than 20% below the target. So we think that your risk is very high in this area. So we've added that information to our risk assessment process. So as you can hear, we're continually working on this. The main tools that we are working from are the rubric, which Tiffany has posted for you, so that we can identify for each data point the 1 to 5 scale of risk. And then we pull all of that information, we take all of those data points and put them into a gigantic and slightly unwieldy Excel file. And for each LEA, we then have a 1 to 5 score for each of those areas of risk that we have evaluated. And then our current process is that we do not weight the different categories. We did a thorough data analysis and tried weighting in a lot of different configurations. So we tried looking at weighting based on school size, based on the type of population that they were serving, based on SEA priorities. So all of those factors, we tried weighting, and it turned out that the SEA priorities, that all of the areas that we would have given more weight to, there actually were several data points that reflected that area. So as an example, one of our state priorities is post-secondary transition, college and career readiness. And there are several indicators that all contribute to a collective understanding of how an LEA is doing in that area. And instead of making one score for post-secondary transition, we have the score for each data point, which when you stack all of the 25 or so data points that we use 5 of those being about post-secondary transition gives weight to that topic without us having to do any extra calculations. And so that data analysis that we've done on an annual basis has driven our decision to continue to not weight different data points, knowing that there are several data points for each broad topic. The last step that we do in this process is to establish cut scores. So we have the 1 through 5 level of risk. We've identified as a state what percentage of our LEAs we would like to see in each of those levels, and we use that tiered approach as opposed to a comparative approach to identify what level of risk each LEA has, and the level of risk identified leads to the level of interventions or services and supports available from USOE to that LEA. That brings us to the close of the Utah section. I know that Tiffany has answered several questions as we've been going through. We would invite any of you who still have questions to post those, and we will address them at the end. And now I'd like to pass things over to our teammates from Kansas. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, this is Dean Zeiss and Vera Struprotne joining you from Kansas. Good morning or afternoon, depending on which side of the Mississippi you're on. So Utah started with what they are doing in terms of identifying and differentiating districts and LEAs for the purpose of monitoring and technical assistance. And so we're going to kind of pick up where they left off and talk to you just briefly about what Kansas has done to address the other side of it. So what do you do once you've identified those districts, and how do you differentiate your monitoring and technical assistance? So Kansas has a combination of both rural and urban districts, though primarily rural in number. And one of the things that we wanted to share with you is that's kind of key to the whole process is that as we have reorganized our team about 3 years ago, we moved to a model in which all of our districts, each of our 286 districts, has a single district contact lead that is an individual from our Department of Education on our early childhood, special education, and title services team, which serves as a direct liaison and representative to that district. And what that means is that while that individual may have a specialty in, say, whether it's Title II or Title III or special education, they are the go-to person for that district and the primary contact for that district. Should that district have questions, the district can still go and talk to the different experts here at the Department of Education if they need to. But if they don't know where to go, they can go to that individual, and we will make sure that they get to the right person. And we have the state itself is broken into several different categories with representatives from each of those groups, and then we all talk to each other. Again, I'm going to keep moving pretty quickly just so we can keep going here. When we talk about our consolidated team, our early childhood, special education, and title services, what we mean in Kansas is that includes our Title I services, our Title I Part C, migrant education, Title IIA, Title III, special education, which in Kansas does also include gifted and students with exceptionalities, and then, of course, our fiscal monitoring. So while it doesn't necessarily include our Perkins and some of our other federal programs, although we're working on incorporating them into the bigger picture. So what do you do once you've figured out once you've differentiated, what do you do with that differentiation? We have, you can't have a discussion about education without talking about triangles. So what we have here is at the base, we have our LEAs that receive TA, which is, we say 100% of LEAs request TA in some form, because, and that could be whether they're calling or emailing, just general questions that they would have for us, that level of technical assistance. Second, we have the Kansas State Department of Education recommending technical assistance. And what that looks like is they've had some kind of a finding or through monitoring where we have determine that they need to have a correction and a follow-up. That could be through fiscal, it could be through IDA, it could be through one of the titles. And then finally, we have those 3% of LEAs that are identified through the differentiated rubric that we use, our Youth Outcome Driven Accountability, or YODA. And that's what Vera is going to speak to you a little bit more about as far as that 3%. What do we do with those very few districts that are identified as having the highest needs?
Okay, and as we talk about that, we're just going to move on for the sake of time right to the process. Again, just to echo what Steve said, those are the 12 districts that we identified as 3%, so 12 districts across the state, and they really are broken up across those regions. As in our risk assessment is very, very similar to what Utah put together in terms of looking at those identified risks. But once we got to that part, one of the things that, sorry about that. One of the things that we did is that we're just going to talk about that process and how that looked. We send a notification letter to each superintendent of the districts identified. Prior to that, we of course let the districts know that we were looking at how we were going to be monitoring differently, and that and explained to them that there was an opportunity for them to be one of the 12, those 12 or in the 3% districts across the state. After that notification letter was sent to those 12 districts, the district leads of each of those regions contacted the superintendent. In many cases, some of those folks already have a relationship because they had worked on other programs. We really tried to tie it to regions that our consultants and our staff were already familiar with so that they would be contacting the superintendent. Then the district lead and the superintendent really worked together to prioritize who would be the team members from the district that would participate, and the needs that would be identified and the needs that would be focused. Of course, in our needs, on our risk assessment, there are several different categories by which they have needs, but part of that process was to really talk about what the needs are and understand the data, as Utah talked about, really to make that a more meaningful process and help our understanding as well as their understanding. As part of that understanding, our team completed what we call a district profile, which was really an internal document that we use to look across all our programs, those early childhood programs that were in the district, the special education programs, the title programs, to see what was reflected across the district. So we would really begin to ask some more deeper questions about what the data that we had entailed. And one of the big pieces of this for several of our districts is that they were already getting some type of technical assistance through the Department of Education. So part of the effort when developing a TA plan when we went on that on-site visit was really to coordinate some of the TA that was happening across the district. So really to have some discussions about what does it look like now in terms of your technical assistance, what could it look like, and what would be most helpful to you, and again, how our roles intersect with each other, how the district roles intersect with our role at KSD. Then at the end of that process, in that initial on-site visit, we provided a meeting summary to the district superintendent, who then forwarded it to the other team members that were involved in the process. And then we're meeting on a monthly basis as part of that process. And I should insert now that this is a pilot year for us. We spent the last 2 years really getting ready to embark on that interaction with the districts. And so this is a pilot year. So through this pilot year, we are making some effort to really evaluate our process, looking at what's happening with the LEA and what's happening here at KSD and doing it on an ongoing basis, so we can really be thoughtful and intentional about looking at our risk assessment for this coming school year and what are the pieces that we'll take into consideration, what really worked well, what didn't work as well as we were having those discussions with each of the districts. So as I said earlier, we really were, one of the things as we talked to each other and talked to the district, we wanted to emphasize that we were really having those discussions based on the areas on the risk rubric that were high, that they had high ratings. So similar to Utah where they assessed that on a 1 to 5 scale, we were looking more at a 3-point scale, but really focusing on those areas that were high risk in those discussions. So we could be very intentional about the TA we provided, certainly support that area, but also have a target so that we were being able to define what was happening and how we could help with those areas. So prior to that on-site visit that I talked about earlier, though, we scheduled a conference call, and we wanted to make sure that that conference call had the right people at the table, and then that those people would be on the on-site visit as well. So, and that was an interactive process by which that initial phone call would last somewhere between 20 minutes and a half an hour, and then deciding what time we would spend on the on-site. So typically the on-sites that we've done have been 2 to 3 hours, but again, determined by what those conversations that we had initially. At the on-site visit, we look at the existing data that we have. We share that with them. If they want to give us additional data that supplements that data, that's a time to look at that. In some cases, some of the districts have sent us that data before we have gone on the on-site so we could see it ahead of time. The other thing, too, in an effort to, again, look at the coordination, looking at the existing plans they have. So in terms of if they have a plan for their Title III work, if they have a corrective action plan under, let's say, like Indicator 12 for special education, looking at those things ahead of time so we have a real picture of what that looked like and that we could address those things, again, across the TA plan. And as I mentioned before, one of the things that has been really important to us and that we want to continue to maintain and enhance is that evaluation piece of how this is working for the districts and if we're impacting really change at a district level over time. So we have coordinated these efforts through our technical support network, which houses our evaluation team here at KSD. And then those evaluations will be completed by the superintendent and the leads here at KSD. And we have other pieces that we're going to include in that evaluation process as well. And we're still working out those details as we work very closely with the evaluation team. And we'll continue to use data to define our own and refine our own process. So just a few of the lessons that we learned in terms of going through this process as we work through it is that just that piece of professional learning, learning across our team and particularly across our team, but also the district teams in terms of what do district staff and what do KSD staff know about all the programs that we interact with. One of the important things for us was really to develop initially that initial work to really develop a core group of folks who had knowledge in the federal programs that we have so that we could discuss that and move forward with what were the requirements. We saw a question earlier about stakeholder feedback asking if it included families and representatives from Parent Training Information Center. We did have that stakeholder feedback as part of our ESEA waiver stakeholder group, as well as our kiosk stakeholder group, which is the Kansas Integrated Accountability. And I should mention, too, that our Kansas Integrated Accountability System that is now looking across the programs that we identified earlier, our title Special Education and Early Childhood Programs, was originally what we looked at under our special education general supervision and the compliance indicator work. So that has really broadened. So that stakeholder group also has broadened. So we really have tried to align what we do here at the agency with the stakeholders that we see in the field as well. Some of the other things that were required are work patience and flexibility, a real paradigm shift, particularly for our state education agency staff, really the shifting responsibilities, changing roles, really looking at supporting a region, but also still maintaining your expertise, but also getting broader within your expertise. So if you're an early childhood person who did parents as teachers previously, to expand that knowledge to across our early childhood programs, but then also broaden your knowledge to title and special education as well. Lots of intentional team meetings through our weekly team meetings, understanding lingo of all the federal programs, which many of you I'm sure can appreciate, and then making sure that the district personnel, the right people are at the table in terms of meeting the needs and having the discussions that were relevant at the local level. And then that ongoing evaluation that I mentioned before.
So I know we kind of blew through that really fast because we kind of had some technical hiccups there, but we wanted to leave some time yet for questions and from our friends at Department of Ed. So with that, let me go ahead and kick it back to Steve.
Okay. Thank you all for your patience. Thank you to Kansas and Utah for sharing the systems and how those work in your state. I'm looking at the questions right now. I see a question that hasn't been answered yet about would Utah be willing to share the FICAM risk rubric? And I think that link was shared out, but we can share it out again.
Steve, this is Jennifer.
Yes.
I thought they were asking about the overall rubric where we collect all of the risk scores. So we do have a risk rubric that's very specific to financial risk, and I will hunt down and post that link right away.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. And I see Alice Ridgway has asked a question about how does this apply to Part C, and I think we have our representatives from the U.S. Department of Education here, and I think they can answer that question, so I will turn it over to Charlie if he's still on the line.
I am. Hi, Alice. It's Charlie. Glad to have your question. This is actually something we've spent a lot of time talking about, is how the rules and the uniform guidance, and particularly these rules around risk assessment, apply to Part C. You'll notice in the uniform guidance there are definitions or sort of determining factors for whether something's a contract or a subgrant, and this is sort of an ongoing conversation I know we've had with Part C. So this risk assessment, this concept of it is really tied in with subrecipients, and that's where the requirements are in the uniform guidance under 203.31. But I think if you take a look back, you'll see that when we look at the relationship between lead agencies in Part C and those contracts in Part C, they really resemble a lot more those subrecipient relationships. So it makes sense that you're looking at risk. There's an FAQ on the department's website that addresses this somewhat, and I can send that to you. And it just basically says that there are requirements that look a lot like a risk assessment that you would do for a contractor in determining if they're able to do the work and meet the requirements in the law. And I think another thing that I've considered a lot is there's really no prohibition. If you have a risk assessment process in Part C, there's certainly nothing that would keep you from doing that and for looking at risk as subrecipients. As I said, a lot of the requirements make a lot of sense, right? So I saw your earlier question you were asking about local determinations and how they would impact your risk assessment. And certainly that makes a lot of sense, right? That would be a future predictor potentially of noncompliance. So that would be something that you would want to include in your risk assessment. Again, really good point maybe for some future conversation if you want to get in touch. I hope that answers your question. If not, just go ahead and type something else into the text box.
So this is Dean in Kansas. Do we have time to address some more questions?
Yeah, we have a few more minutes. 5 more.
We're going to address the question. There are two questions. The Part C piece of the question, how does this impact the Part C side? And I'm going to address this as quickly as possible, but there's sort of two things at work. One of them is that in our district profiles that we completed, we did have a Part C piece of that to look across our programs to see if some of the targeted technical assistance that was taking place in Part C was aligned with some of the districts that we saw who were at highest risk. So there was that piece. Also, there is a proposal by our legislature right now that Part C will come to the Department of Education. It is just a proposal at this point in time. But in 6 months, we could probably tell you a lot more about that if that happens, because then they'll be included in this process as well. So stay tuned for that. The other question was around school improvement. How does the school improvement process work in this part? So we have been working on that. We are trying with one of our on-site visits, we're trying really hard to be more intentional about including that because we have several priority schools and focus schools within that district. So when we do the next on-site to that district, we'll be including discussions about those buildings as well in our overall district discussion.
Wonderful. I see that someone has asked, can you share the FAQ with everything? That came from Beth Cole, and I believe that came in during Charlie's explanation of how it applies to Part C. And then there was another comment that came in from Tracy about sharing the tools and resources with Cypher, and great idea. And so if any of the presenters or any of the OSEP staff have materials, if they could send them to me, we can share that out, that information out on our Cypher listserv for all the participants that participate in that.
Thank you, Mel.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat windows. So unless another question comes in shortly, I want to thank Kansas and Utah for presenting their systems and being willing to share with their colleagues across the country. And I want to thank the staff at the U.S. Department of Education for being present on the call, and thank you all for joining us. It was hopefully a good call aside from the technical difficulties, and hopefully you all learned a lot that you can use in your work in states. So thank you.